And one of the great things that we saw last week was that we came into this world with nothing. We will leave with nothing. Everything we have is a gift from God. And when God takes that away from us, He's done us no wrong whatsoever. He's not done any wrong. That doesn't mean we don't hurt. That doesn't mean we don't have great emotional pain. Job did. Job cried and wept. We'll see more of that in the weeks to come, Lord willing. That is not the lessen pain. That is not the lessen the agony of loss whatsoever. And that is not to say all our questions are answered. However, the wisdom of Job and the wisdom of the Bible there in the first chapter is very much on the fact that we as human beings don't deserve anything. So everything good that we have is a gift from God. And if that is our attitude, it's going to very much help us in suffering. It's going to very much help us when we go through difficulties. Is that, as Charles Spurgeon said, if I'm alive and not in hell, I have nothing to complain about, is what Spurgeon said. And he's very true about that. Here in the second chapter, we see that the devil is not going to quit that easy. And let's just start here in verse 1 in just a minute. And the focus I want us to have tonight is this great truth that we're going to see in a few minutes, is that as people under God, He is the Creator. I am a creation. As people under God, we have to accept both good and evil from God. We have to accept both good and bad from Him, as Job points out here, and as we'll see in a few minutes. Well, let's start here in verse 1 tonight. And what we have in verse 1, in the first few verses, is something extremely similar to what we have in chapter 1. This is another scene in heaven. I don't know how far away this was as far as time frame goes. I don't know if this was weeks, months, but I would say it's a pretty close time frame here. Let's start in verse 1 and we'll just read down together. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." I take that as Peter speaks about in 1 Peter, I believe it is, in chapter 5, he talks about the devil roaming about, seeking whom he may devour. Let me read that. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. The apostle tells us this: "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." That is the devil. As we saw last week, the devil cannot be in more than one place at a time. He is not God. He is not everywhere. The devil, though, is certainly on earth at times. Very, very, very probable, if not certain, that none of us have encountered the devil before. We encounter his demons. We encounter his people doing his work, as we'll see here later in this passage. But here is the devil. He's going around the earth. He's seeking whom he may devour. And then verse 3, "The Lord said to Satan, 'Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil.'" Now here's what is added as opposed to what chapter 1 had to say. This is what is now said about Job. "And he still holds fast his integrity." So what was the devil's aim in chapter 1? What did the devil want to do in chapter 1? Make Job curse God. To make Job sin and also to dishonor God. Satan's purpose was twofold. Ultimately, Satan wanted to try to discredit God. and to say to God, you're not worthy enough for people to serve you. The only reason they serve you is for what they can get out of you. You're not that great after all, God. Secondly, the devil wanted to go after Job and say, Job's not that great. The only reason he follows your commands is because you protect him and give him everything. If you take back your hand of blessing, he'd curse you. So that is what the devil wanted to do. What you find in verse 3 is this. God says Job still holds his integrity. He hasn't sinned against me. Like we said last week, when you go through a great trial in life, it may not be because you sinned. It may be because you're a very righteous person by God's grace. And God is testing you. And God is trying to vindicate you even in the presence of the devil. We just don't know why we go through the things we go through sometimes. We don't know. I don't know. You do something, you go through something 5, 10, 20 years ago. There's times in life, often I would say, that we can look back from a distance and we can see God's hand in all of that and how He led us. This is not something bad that happened to me. But when right out of high school, I went to a community college and I had to take a speech class. And I never spoke in front of people. But I had to speak this is before I was a preacher. And I think God was using that to kind of get me out of my shell, kind of trying to help me learn how to speak, some at least. So we can look back at our lives and see God's hand in it. But normally when we're in the storm, we don't know what's going on, do we? We don't know why this is happening. Sometimes though, we look back and we say, I just don't know why that happened. I have no idea why it happened. And we have to trust God with that. But here, Job did not give in to the devil's temptation. Job holds his integrity. God vindicates the name of Job. And then look what he says at the end of verse 3. Although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. Now that does not mean God did not have a reason for doing what He did. What that means is, though Job is a sinner, and Job is going to die one day because he's a sinner, just like all of us are going to die one day, because we've all sinned. Yet at that time in Job's life, Job did not directly do something that caused God's anger and wrath on him at that time. That's what God is saying here. Yes, of course, Job's a sinner. Job would freely admit that I've sinned against God in my life. He needs a sacrifice. He's offering sacrifices for his children. Yes, Job is not sinless. Only Jesus is sinless. And yet what God is saying here is this. I did these things not because Job deserved them in the moment. That's what He's saying here. So you see this scene in heaven happening. And one thing, and this is humbling, that's one of the great themes of the book of Job, is to humble us. We all, including myself, we all need humbled. We need to make sure that we're low, not because we want to think lower of ourselves as what we really are, but it just is the fact that we are low and God is high. And God wants to make us be humble before Him. One thing that we get from the book of Job is that God's not in our story. We are in God's story. That's one of the things you see in these first 2 chapters. God and the devil is in heaven. They're talking about Job. Job has no idea what's going on. We're privileged. We are in God's story. Now, God is most certainly in our story in the sense that He's in our life. He loves us. He cares for us. We're made in His image. His Son has died for us. But we're part of God's story. I wouldn't even say we're the earth. Let's just say we're the earth. God is the sun. We go around Him. Everything goes around the sun. Everything looks to God, not us. And that's a humbling thing, isn't it? It's humbling for us to say, you know what? Life is not about me. My life is not even meant to be lived for me. My life is meant to be lived for God. That's a humbling confession, but it's a true confession. So we see that scene in heaven in chapter 2. And then I want you to notice Satan's new slander. What did he say about Job in chapter 1? That's right. The devil basically said to the Lord, you've put a hedge around Job. You're protecting him. Of course he's going to serve you. You take that hedge back, he's going to curse you. So what we saw in chapter 1 is God allowed, the devil can't do anything without God's permission. God allowed the devil to take his property, to take his wealth, to kill his servants, to kill his children. The devil was found out to be a liar, as he is. Job did not curse God. But here's his new slander. And you all have probably figured this out, haven't you? That the devil does not stop at one defeat. I remember, this is some years ago, I was sitting, I believe, at maybe my computer desk back in my home. I was just a new preacher and just preached for maybe a couple of years, and I was really struggling with my assurance of salvation. I just couldn't get assurance. And all of a sudden, God gave me assurance. And almost the moment that I knew I was saved, the new thought came into my mind. How do you know you're really called to preach? Are you really called to preach, Clint? And by God's grace at that moment, it just hit me, hey, the devil he's moved too fast on this one. I know that's the devil. He's gone too fast. But I say that just to say this. The devil tempts us, and we are successful by God's grace to say no to him and to keep our integrity and not sin. The devil's coming back. He may not come back that fast. But when he left Jesus in the wilderness, the Bible tells us that he left him until an opportune time. Here's an opportune time for the devil to attack Job. Here's his new slander, verse 4. Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his sin. Now there's some debate, question about what exactly this means. Let's read verse 5 and then I'll tell you what I think and other people think it means. Verse 5, however, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh. He will curse you to your face. I think what the devil is saying there is this. Lord, yes, you took away his possessions and even his kids, but skin for skin. Job would give up those things as long as he can keep his skin. Though I'm sure he didn't want to give up. This is the devil speaking, so to speak. I'm sure he didn't want to give up his kids. I'm sure he didn't want to give up his wealth. But as long as he's not touched, he'll even give up his wealth and his children. If you don't touch him, he'll be okay. But then the devil says this. He says, but if you put forth your hand and touch his actual body, touch his bone and flesh, not his children's flesh, but his flesh, the devil says he'll curse you to your face. That's the new slander here of the devil. And then look in verse 6. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power. Only spare his life. One of the key things to remember, and we'll see more of this, but one of the key things to remember here is that God does no wrong to Job. And Job says as much. Even in all this, God has done him no wrong. Why? He deserves to die and go to hell. He's done him no wrong here. In fact, God most certainly has a plan and a purpose. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Well, look at Job's physical suffering. Verse 7. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. I think we get a picture there of there's no way to get relief. I mean, if you break your leg, this is before modern medicine. If you break your leg, you can get some relief. You sit down and you at least don't move it. But here's a man with boils all over his flesh from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. How can he get relief? You can't sit. There's boils there. You can't try to lay down and get comfortable. You can't stand. This is a picture of Job going through an intense suffering, intense pain that will not allow him to have any rest. Today we'd call it chronic suffering or chronic pain, wouldn't we? And you know, I feel for those people, and there's people in the church right now who go through almost pain all the time. And some of you may have gone through that, just pain all the time. I don't know how that is. I don't want to know how that is. I'll probably know something about it one day, though. But to have pain non-stop, oh my. Here's a man. He's been wealthy. He's a righteous man. He loves God. He obeys God. His wealth is gone. His children is gone. Now his health is gone. And look at this great man in verse 8. And this should tell us that we should never judge Christians simply because of the situation they're in. Now, if we know they've committed some great sin, it's not gossip, but we know that, then we may say, you know what, maybe I should talk to him about that sin. But if you see a Christian, as far as you know, a godly person from a distance suffering, that does not mean at all that they have sinned. Here's Job. He's not sinned. And he's lost everything. And a big portion of the book going on is about just that. Verse 8. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Here's the greatest man. There's not a man like him on earth. His wealth is gone. His children are gone. His servants are gone. His health is gone. And now he finds himself not in his nice house that God had blessed him with. He finds himself sitting in ashes. Some people think maybe he went to the dump of the city, maybe. It may very well be when the lightning struck, most likely lightning, fire from heaven in chapter 1. He's gone out there to where that's happened. He's sitting in the ashes. He's scraping maybe the stuff out of the boils. He's sitting there. And later in this chapter, we're not going to look at it tonight, his friends, when they come, they start weeping. Why? Because they cannot even recognize who he is anymore. This is terrible suffering, isn't it? And here's the terrible thing about it. This is not the worst that Job suffers. Just when you think there's nothing worse for us to go through, we find somebody else that's gone through worse, don't we? Here is Job. He's lost basically everything. And yet verse 9 tells us about possibly, up to this point, his worst temptation of all. And that's what comes from his wife. Verse 9, it's very interesting, and people have brought this out before. Satan had all the power he wanted to take anything from Job that he could. And he doesn't take his spouse. And the reason for that is the devil has other plans for his spouse. His spouse is now going to do the devil's will and speak the devil's words to Job. I mean, just think about this. Here's a man, he's lost everything. You can't even imagine what he's going through, basically. And there's one person left in your life that you can depend on. The Bible doesn't talk basically anything about Job's wife. I may be wrong, but I assume Job's wife was a godly person that loved God. And you know what? I had really forgotten. The fact is this, Job's wife lost those children too, didn't she? Job's wife lost her wealth too. Job's wife lost the servants. Job's wife lost, again, the children. They're all dead. And what I think we see here is this. We see a godly woman, most likely, who has given in to sorrow and temptation. And now, instead of being a helpmeet to her husband, she becomes a great thorn in his side. We can, on one level, we say, what would I do? Don't we? I mean, here's Job's wife. She's lost 10 children. And now her husband has all this. We can say that, and yet we have to acknowledge she did a great sin here as well. She did great evil. Verse 9. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Do you still claim to have not sinned, Job?" It's at least part of what she's saying there. Do you still claim to be a righteous man? God would not do this to a righteous man or a righteous woman. Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Die, Job. Get it over with. Some people think she's saying to kill himself. It doesn't say that. She could be saying that, though. Wow, what does she say there? She says, curse God and die. Look what verse 3 at the end. Verse 3 talks about still holding fast his integrity. And then verse 5 is actually the verse I'm looking for about halfway through. What does the devil say? He will curse you to your face. And here is the wife, and it could have been the husband, doesn't matter if it's the wife or husband. But here is the wife speaking exactly what Satan wants her to speak here. I'm not saying she was possessed, but she is doing the devil's work. And as it's been pointed out many times, the people closest to us can bring the most harm to us. Eve tempted Adam to sin. Peter did tempt Jesus, but obviously Jesus did not give in to the temptation. Sometimes it's a child to a parent. Especially in our day and time, a child grows up and confesses to be homosexual and begins to go to the parent and say, look, I'm a Christian too. And finally the parent gives in and says, well, I guess that's okay after all. My child's like that. Or a parent, very often a parent is the bad influence on the child. Here you have as a wife. You see a wife being a bad influence to a husband. You see husband being a bad influence to the wife. These closest relationships. If in David's life, David's son fell into sin in part because his first cousin led him into sin. You remember the David's son that raped his half-sister? Well, who gave him that plan? It was that son's first cousin that did that. So we see sometimes it's family, sometimes it's friends, sometimes the people closest to us, even though they could be good Christians, but at this time, they're doing the devil's will. So one thing that tells us is when we deal with people in life, we need good counsel. I need counsel. I need help. You need help. Ultimately, we have to listen to God, don't we? We have to make sure we know what He says to us, what He is leading us to do here. Let me just read just a little bit of poetry. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll take maybe just a few portions of it. But this really gets to what the devil is communicating to Job here. Dost thou not see that thy devotion's vain? What have thy prayers procured but woe and pain? Those painful sores and all thy losses show how heaven regards the foolish saint below. That's what the devil wants us to think. We go through great suffering, we go through great heartache, something happens in our life and we just can't understand it. The devil wants to come to us and say, look at all those prayers you made. Well, how's that treated you lately? Look at all, you fasted and prayed. And they still died, didn't they? I guess that's what God thinks of you. Oh, you're a saint. You're going to heaven. Funny thing is, heaven just poured out upon you all this suffering. I guess that's what heaven thinks about you, isn't it? I remember a preacher, he's gone on to be with the Lord. Either before or after a prayer made at the dinner table, somebody said to him, well, go ahead and pray to your plate. There's no God. Just go ahead and pray to your plate. That's what the devil wants to do to us. We go through suffering. Jesus is in the wilderness. The devil comes to him and says, if you be the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. I mean, you're out here. You claim to be God's Son. You were just baptized. The Father supposedly said from heaven, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. And now you're out here in the wilderness with no food for 40 days. I mean, if you're the Son of God, why don't you just show us that you're the Son of God? See, the devil knows how to get us. You take somebody who's had an upbringing where they're more prone to sin and things. They haven't been taught the Ten Commandments. They haven't been taught righteous living at all. And they're over here and they get saved. The devil may drive them to the other side of the boat and they may become a Pharisee and sin in that way. Or you have somebody over here and they were raised in not a Bible-believing home only, but like in a Pharisee home, that you got to do this and that to be saved, and all these checklists and everything like that. Well, they start to move over here to a more biblical understanding, and before you know it, the devil's got them over on this side of the boat, and they're saying, you know what, maybe there's errors in the Bible after all. You see, the devil will try to get us any way that he can. And here the devil can't get Job by taking his property or his children, but the devil is going to take his body away from him and then use his wife to see what happens. This is terrible stuff. But what does Job say about this? Verse 10. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. And I believe there that this is kind of, though certainly it's a rebuke, it's kind of a tempered rebuke. Kind of a tempered rebuke. He could have said a lot worse than that. But he did rebuke his wife. Here's what I want us to see, and this is the main focus I want us to have tonight, is this great statement. I mean, think of this. This is not a man writing a book on theology. This is not a man at a seminary writing a commentary on Job. Nothing wrong with that. This is not a preacher standing and preaching about Job. This is Job himself suffering all this in the moment. This is what this great man says. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity or evil? That's such a simple statement, yet it's absolutely profound. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? Job says to his wife, we take all this good from God, and when He sends us something bad, we don't want it. If we thank God and trust Him when He gives us good things, why can we not trust Him and in a true sense thank Him even when He gives us bad things? Why can't we do that for Him? In our hearts, if we say, you know what, I just can't accept good and evil from God. Now, this is not saying God does evil. God does us no wrong. But God allows evil to happen. If we can't accept the bad things and the trials that God gives us, which all of us struggle with, don't we? But if we can't accept that, if we accept good, but we can't accept the bad from God, do you know what we say? Now, none of us would want to say this, but we say we're wiser than God, don't we? We thank God for the good that He gives us. When He's blessing us, we think God is such a wise Creator. He's so benevolent. He's loving. He's so righteous and just. And He's so wonderful. But when bad comes to our life, do we still think God is all-wise? You know, this is challenging, isn't it? When things are good in our life, we think God is good, and we're right to think that, but when our good God gives us something bad, do we still think He's good? If we're not careful, what happens is this: we turn ourselves into a God. This is what Christians can do. This is what I can do. We see these terrible things happening. We see bad things, terrible things happening to ourselves, to our family, to the people we love. And we're tempted to think that we're more loving than God. We're tempted to think we're more wise than God. We're tempted to think we're more righteous than God. We may even possibly be tempted that we could run the universe better than God. Why are you doing this, God? And what we have to say is this: God is all wise. He's all good. He's faithful. He's loving. I do not understand why this is happening, but I know He knows better than I know. I know He does. So though He slay me, as Job says later in this book, yet will I trust Him. Again, what we see in Job is this deep humility, and what goes hand in hand with the deep humility is a deep trust in God. Job is a man of deep humility, and he is a man of deep trust in God. He's a man that's humbled himself before God, and he looks up to Him, and even in terrible times, he knows that God is wise, God is good. He does not minimize the hurt. In chapter 3, Job wants to die, and he doesn't sin in wanting that. Now, he does not try to kill himself. That would be sin. But Job wants to die. He's hurting so much. When you think about God giving us good and evil, that is not to minimize the evil. Some of you have gone through great evil. You've gone through great hurt. You don't understand why things have happened. And all your questions will never be answered this side of eternity. And even as we look at these first 2 chapters, all of your questions aren't answered. You don't understand still. That's true. That is not to minimize any suffering. That is not to minimize any true hurt. Life hurts. We're fallen people. People do bad things. Bad things happen. But this is to remind us and to teach us that God is all-wise. He loves us. And He has a purpose behind all of this. He knows what He's doing. And we can trust Him. I've mentioned this before. The State of Theology was a survey that's gone out. One of the questions in that survey, or one of the statements in that survey is this: God is a perfect being and cannot make a mistake. In 2020 in America, only 65% of the people could definitely agree with that. Either strongly agree or agree. What that means is basically 35% of the people in America either believe that God can make a mistake or they don't know. What is going on? What is going on? This is one of the most frightening things of that survey was 2 years prior in 2018 in the UK. To that same statement, God is a perfect being and cannot make a mistake, only 22% of the people agreed with that. 78% of the people in the UK in 2018 either thought God could make a mistake or they didn't know for sure. What is going on? I'm telling you, if we believe that God can do wrong or God can make a mistake, we are going to be in deep trouble. Because we won't have any foundation for anything. And that's what's happening to countries right now and people. If we believe that God's not righteous, what are we going to do? We can't do anything. If we don't believe that God is a righteous God, let's close the building down. Let's just leave and go home. We're wasting our time tonight. There's no point to life if God's not righteous. But God is righteous. God is righteous. And whatever He allows in righteousness. He's done no wrong to Job. Job says that. Job, He's done no wrong to me, is what he says in effect. What's he say in chapter 1? Verse 21, the very end, blessed be the name of the Lord. That's when all of his children are dead and his property. Blessed be His name. What's it say at the end of verse 10 of chapter 2? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. He did not blame God. Again, Job in verse 10 says, "Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity?" He says we have to accept what God gives us. God is good, wise, holy, just. Let's accept what He gives us. None of us want the bad in our life. Nobody wants bad in their life. And yet if God allows that into our life, it must be for a reason. Well, what does it look like to accept good and bad? I've already said some about that. It does not mean that we pretend there's no pain in life. There is great grief in life. It does not mean that we act like we have all the answers, because we don't at all have all the answers. It doesn't mean that we never cry and weep and hurt, because we certainly do. But it does mean that we know that God's done us no wrong, and we trust what He's doing. Now let me give you a long list, and there's many more that could be added. But let me give you a long list of just reasons, some particularly looking at Job, but probably most of these just looking at suffering in general. Let me give you a list of why God possibly could allow suffering to take place. Number one, sin in general. That's why we all will die one day. It's because we've all sinned against God, and there's a penalty for sin. It's death. So all of us will physically die one day. Number two, sin in particular. And this is one of the main themes in Job, is that you can be a righteous person and suffer, and it's not because of sin. But still, in the Bible, certainly people sin because of particular sins they commit. Number three, God allowed Job to suffer to vindicate him, to show the devil, to show the world, to show us that Job indeed was a righteous man. He wasn't just serving God to get what he could get. He was serving God because he loved God. He was a righteous man. Number four, to vindicate God, to show that God is worthy of worship, that God is worthy of us serving Him. Whether He slays us or not, He's still worthy of it. Job is a picture of Jesus. Job helps us understand Jesus and for the Old Testament to look forward to Jesus. Job, on one level, is an innocent sufferer, but Jesus is the only true innocent sufferer. Job is a picture of Jesus. It shows us an example of godly suffering to follow. We look at Job and we say, that's the way we need to suffer when suffering comes to us. It helps us with that. This suffering helps us grow, and you can fill in all kinds of stuff with this. It helps us grow in our faith. It helps us grow in our holiness. It puts the fear of God in us. All that is true. It reminds us of judgment. When I go through suffering and I start to hurt, I hurt something, it reminds me, or it ought to remind me, there is a judgment coming one day. This life is not all there is. There is a judgment coming. And God awakens men and women at times through great suffering to seek Him so they can be saved. It reminds us that we are not home yet. As comfortable as our life may be, suffering reminds us to put our hope in heaven, not on earth. It teaches us how to minister to other people. How many of you have gone through suffering before, and now you can put your arm around somebody and weep with them and pray with them and counsel them because you've gone through that before too? It helps us know God deeper. That's what we find in the very last chapter of the book, or close to it. Job says, I've heard of you with the hearing of my ear. This is a righteous man. He says to God, I've heard of you with the hearing of my ear, but now my eyes see you. He knew God in a deeper way. It shows that the righteous suffer. It gives us a greater reward. Job is in eternity now, never to leave, and he has great reward for his temporary suffering he went through. He's going to have a better resurrection because of the suffering he went through. It can help rescue us from eternal suffering. Again, that temporary suffering in this life, even as terrible as it is, can open our eyes up to eternal suffering and make us want to avoid that. It can protect us from greater evils. Some suffering comes in our life And it helps us not go into deeper sin because we're afraid to do that now. It helps us be a witness to the lost world that God is enough. I don't have anything anymore, but God is enough and I still love Him. We are witnesses to God. It shows God's righteousness in the fact that He punishes sinners. It will humble us and also humble the people who see us suffer. It will lead us to pray more. And ultimately, all suffering glorifies God in the ways that He has ordained. And there's so many other things that we could see, but that is a list of just the possible reasons why God could have us suffer. Now, let me give you an example tonight, and it's an example I've told you about before, but it's so helpful. It's the example of Amy Carmichael. Amy Carmichael, famous missionary to India, spent over 50 years there and was buried there. She died in the early 1950s, I believe. Well, she had 1 year of her life where a Christian lady who had meant so much to her died. They were caring for children. They would rescue children from prostitution and things. They would rescue the children. Well, some of the children were sick, and at least one had died. A co-worker, a leader on the mission field died. A co-worker became sick, and also her mother died. 1 year. And I guess somebody was trying to cheer Amy Carmichael up, and they said, Amy, it's just hard to see how God's going to turn this out for good. And Amy said, you don't have to see when you know. And that's the faith God wants us to have. We don't have to see how God's going to take evil and bring good about. We just have to know that He does and believe Him. What discussion do we have tonight? What comes to mind as we look at this second chapter of Job? Yeah. 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 You're either in sin or you're not saved or something along those lines. That's just look at yeah. He was righteous. Right. Even through all this, he didn't sin, and still, God allowed it. Yeah. Just when we hear messages like that really focus on, health, wealth, if you love Jesus all and you follow Jesus all, everything's going to be great. Right. Not necessarily. As a matter of fact, a lot of times your life is hard. Whether that's with sin or with suffering, not because of sin. Yeah. Yeah, the prosperity gospel teaches, hey, if you really love God, if you got enough faith, you're going to be healed. If you're sick, you're in sin. If you're not rich, there's something wrong with you, or you need to give. And if you're a Christian, you're going to be prospering. That's what the health, wealth, prosperity preaching is. That's what many of the mega church, certainly not all, but that's what many of the mega churches are in America. They preach this stuff that won't last for a minute in the real world. And they get rich off of it. And they take this so-called gospel, which is not a gospel, but another gospel. They take it and they take it to third world countries with them. And take advantage of people there. So this does away with all, just like you said, that's a very good comment. Job is a righteous man. He loves God. He's done nothing to deserve this. And God in His purposes is allowing this to happen to him. Any other discussion tonight? Well, may the Lord bless us tonight. May the Lord bless His Word. We're grateful and thankful for it.